Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please visit avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am joined by Samuel Shephard, professor of environmental biology and stewardship.
It's called environmental science.
Environmental science at Ave Maria University. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, so we're so glad to have you on the show. You've been involved in environmental science and stewardship for over 20 years now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I started a long time ago as a commercial fisherman and kind of progressed through to where I am now, which is a researcher, essentially, and teacher.
That's great. Science, yeah. Again, we're so glad to have you here. You did your PhD research, I guess, on the ecology of exploited catfishes in Mississippi State.
That's right, yeah.
So you've been all over the place,
fun.
And obviously it doesn't sound like you're from Mississippi. Where are you from?
No, that's right. Well, I was originally from Scotland, but I've lived in Ireland the last 25, 26 years, something like that. Yeah, I met my wife there.
Okay, and what a gift now to be with us at Ave Maria. We're glad to have you here. So I maybe want to begin with kind of like a little bit of a provocative question. I have a friend who I remember one time we were on a family vacation, and somebody was talking about turning, making sure we turn off the lights at night so the turtles don't get confused and everything. And at some point, this wonderful woman just said, kind of like, I'm sick of the turtles. Yeah. I'm sick of the turtles. And she said, we don't even protect the unborn in our country, right? Why should we be worrying about the environment? And I think that's kind of a heartfelt concern that some people have. Not everyone listening to the show may be having that, but I definitely think some of us. How would you answer that, right?
Yeah, that's slightly the question I've been posing myself for a long time, is whether I should be a kind of professional Catholic who's trying to inform or look to the scientific community, or whether I should be a professional scientist who's trying to inform Catholics. Because it seems like, we can't avoid the environmental issue, it's always there, but it seems like the environmental movement's so right on some things and so misguided in some other things, and maybe they've got their hierarchy of issues right. But I'm also concerned there's a lot of Catholics who don't realise that the Church itself has a really beautiful and wonderful and well-developed and really enduring understanding of environmental stewardship. So we know how to do this, and what I want to express to the rest of the world is we actually might be the best at doing this, as we are with all these other things. We're so confident to talk about sexuality and marriage and everything. We know the Church is right, but maybe we're less confident when we come to the Catholic teaching on the environment.
Yeah, and it is interesting. So at the end of the 20th century, John Paul II published an encyclical on faith and reason, and how strange it was that the Catholic Church is one of the few institutions defending human reason's ability to know the truth at the end of the 20th century. And in another way, it's almost that perhaps it's only with faith that we actually really understand creation. And so we can, Catholics actually can really have a deep sense for the genuine dignity of creation, or at least each part of creation having a proper role, and that we can recognize it because we see it as part of the larger whole. So what would you say a little bit about that? I know in your book, you recently gave a course for Ave Maria's Pursuit of Wisdom, I think called
Stewarding the Environment.
Stewarding the Environment. And you spoke there a little bit about the book of creation and the book of Revelation.
Yeah. So,
how can we learn to see creation as a book?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of questions in there, aren't there? The first one is, I think, to do with the difference between thinking about the natural world as just nature, which is kind of an ecological flux, basically. And you might be interested in looking after that for essentially utilitarian reasons, right? Because if we mess up on this planet Earth, then we've nowhere else to go. Or you can think about the natural world as creation, that is, that it's made, and it's made by a God who loves us, and who made it with some transcendent and ultimate end. And that makes it completely changes everything, because it means that when we engage with nature, we're not just thinking about our own needs, but we're actually participating in God's plan for human salvation. So in that case, stewardship of creation becomes a fundamentally faith-filled and God-oriented activity. And I've forgotten what the second part
of
the question
that's
was.
great. Yeah, but I think that's really, and I love that idea that you spoke about that if we simply see nature as kind of something that is outside of being human,
yes,
it's human beings versus nature, then we'll either want to dominate the nature or we'll want to kind of idolize the nature.
Yeah.
But if we see nature and us as part of God's creation, then we see ourselves as somewhat companions.
Yeah.
And our role is unique in the created world, but the created world is also loved by God, right?
Yeah.
And right, even the the stars, the sunsets, the beauty, everything from the alligators in Florida
right.
to the migratory patterns of birds, which are mind-boggling. Sea turtles, by the way, that swim out in the ocean and swim back.
Yeah.
Like, how do they do that?
How do they know? Yeah.
I mean, it's really,
yeah.
It's just you begin to see these elements within creation that it bespeaks a kind of beauty and wonder and goodness and intelligibility.
That's right, and the intelligibility is wonderful. Yeah, I really like the idea of considering creation as God's first book. If you imagine that God's second book, of course, the scriptures, his first book was him pouring out his imagination, his creativity, his nature into this created order we're part of. But as you say, I think fundamental to how we deal with these environmental questions and the actions we choose to take is exactly our anthropology. It's how we understand what it is to be humans, what nature is, and how we kind of interact together. And like you say, I think a lot of the environmental movement is based on either a fairly brutal utilitarianism, where we just look after this because we need to, or a kind of mixture of vaguely esoteric, pantheistic kind of religions. But neither of them allow for, well, they don't allow for two things. They don't allow for the dignity of the human person, that we're somehow set apart as well as just part of this system. But they also don't provide us with a platform from which we can legitimately act charitably, because you can't be a steward unless you intervene. And unless you have some sort of unique capacities and some sort of unique God-given role, then it's very hard to justify taking charge in a way.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis would sometimes say that we were not made to be in a wilderness. We were created to be in a garden. Yes. Right, to bring the natural world, plants, fruit, all this sort of stuff, but even, so to speak, animals somewhat under our tutelage, naming the animals, raising the created world into a garden.
Yes.
Right? A lot of people don't like they want to be in the open world. Of course, he is from England, or he is actually from Northern Ireland, very much so. Yeah. But he lived in England a lot of his life, but there is a certain sense in which that I think that really does say something unique, that we were created to be gardeners and worshipers of God, to take the world and somehow transform it into some kind of ordered, beautiful patterns that respect the natural integrity of the things we are. A gardener can't be a garden. An artificial garden is not a garden, right? A garden has to be full of living things of which I respect the natural order and integrity of each thing.
Yeah, and they're fulfilling their own purpose.
And yet I also, though, coordinate them and raise them up in somehow in a way that requires human intelligence and ultimately glorifies God. So could you speak a little bit about this? Because I think sometimes we have this romanticization of the wilderness.
Yeah, well, I think what you make a really interesting point there, because the way this contrast between wilderness and garden is really significant in the different ways that Christians and secular people concerned with the environment might act. And I think there's a tendency in the environmental movement exactly that, to kind of reverence wilderness as this slightly abstract construct, with the result that there's a tendency to retreat from it. We say, what's left? What haven't we broken? And if it's still out there and it's wild and beautiful and free, we'll just leave it there because it's better off without us. Whereas the Christian idea is to take on this terrifying responsibility to say God's actually given us a universe and then in some way set us apart by intellect and will and by the fact we're made in the image and likeness of God to, exactly like you say, draw that creation with us or through our own intelligence towards him and be involved in, I don't know, I'm not a theologian, but the sanctification of reality in some sort of sense. Yeah.
And I think the other thing we also, in dealing with it, need to also admit that human beings have been bad gardeners.
Oh,
right?
My goodness.
That we are not in the Garden of Eden anymore with our own integrity or living with integrity with respect to the environment. We have become we've broken our families, we've broken our homes, we've broken our relationship with the created world. Yeah. And we've often, it's funny, Lewis would also say that there's this underlying theme that he always wants to keep Reepicheep in the Chronicles of Narnia story anyway, this mouse, away from the circuses, because he says they would do awful things to them. So he also criticizes, and I'm not saying we're criticizing circuses here, that's a separate thing, but he's just saying but he also thinks we can at times remove things so far out of their natural environment that then we're despoiling them. And certainly with respect to the, there have been massive environmental degradations as human beings.
That's for
it
sure.
is Uncle Andrew and the Magician's Nephew, by the way, just for people who may or may not have listened, as he gets to the first Narnian creation and he thinks, wow, I could build things here. We could have munitions factories. Right. So we look at the world as merely raw material to be exploited. So because of that, it's understandable that that people want to simply just protect the wilderness from humans.
Yep.
But I think it's just unrealistic. And it's also not actually authentic, right, to kind of who we are. We may do that at times. There's nothing wrong with having parks or things like that. But right, we also have to recognize, wait a second, human beings are also beautiful. Like, if the sea turtle is beautiful, then actually human beings are even more beautiful.
Even more beautiful. Yeah. I'm always kind of fascinated by this idea of retreat. It seems like this has been such a theme over in the environmental movement since the late 60s, is the idea that the world's better off without humans. And we're better off either reducing the human population or having these massive closed areas. And this is still ongoing. Human population control has become rather unfashionable now, but the current process is really towards, the Convention on Biological Diversity now wants to set aside 30% of the surface of the planet for minimal human use by 2030 and 10% of the planet for almost no human use. So it's exactly the same philosophy that we're not really part of the system, we're just problematic. Whereas the Christian understanding is that we are absolutely part of creation, that we were created within everything else, within the created order, and we kind of evolved up through the middle, and we're literally related to many of the other species, but at the same time we are set apart. So we have this completely unique dynamic where we're part of it, we're embedded in it, and that's really beautiful unto itself. We're also set apart with this capacity to garden it, to take charge of it. Yeah.
Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is you also have done a lot of work, and I believe you're writing a book on hunting.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So I believe, I don't know if this story is true, but I've heard it, and I think it's worth repeating. It ought to be true if it's not true. That after the movie Bambi in the 50s, I believe, hunting went down by 40% in the United States because all of a sudden all these young girls or maybe young boys and girls didn't want their dads going off killing Bambi's mother.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so, this sort of sense that just emotionally we've become, we don't like hunting in a way. We don't like killing animals. We eat them all the time, but we don't want to think about the fact that we're killing them. And sometimes I think people all of a sudden just discover that what's actually happening, and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to eat anymore. So then they become vegans or vegetarians just because they actually for the first time consider what's actually going on. So you make an argument, though, that hunting and kind of stewardship go hand in hand.
Yes.
That it's often sometimes the hunters that are the great conservationists. And this, of course, is a kind of a fascinating, another kind of fascinating, maybe, thorny topic. So what would you say to kind of saying, well, we were meant to garden, not to hunt?
So I think it seems to me, and I've thought about this a lot, I've been trying to work on this in parallel between papers in scientific journals and also more sort of theologically oriented ideas, including this. It seems to me very reasonable, there's a lot of evidence for this, the most profoundly effective steward will be the one who's most embedded in a place, because from place comes care and identity, right? This is where I am, this is my community, I care for it, I want to do something about it, I want to look after it. So you're massively incentivized to look after this place that you care for, this community that's engaged in that place. But the way to develop that sense of place is to conduct activities which are deeply embedded in that place. And hunting and fishing are really, I think, unique ones in that they require an extraordinary level of understanding of where you are, of how the ecosystems function. Right, you're very strongly incentivized to understand where the animals are going to be and what they're eating, and how you're likely to encounter them. So through that comes a really profound knowledge of how this ecosystem functions, a sense of place, a sense of identity and care. And then what stewardship comprises was stewardship's basically about sustainable practices oriented towards some sort of flourishing or the common good of the human person and of biodiversity. So who's going to care most and who's actually going to have the capacity to do the things which are really going to work in this position? Well, it'll be the people who are deeply embedded there. So that's one aspect of the hunting and fishing thing. The other is that these activities kind of make unavoidably present to you this human responsibility, the fact that you actually engaged with killing something. It's very hard to do that, even if you've been hunting all your life, without these moral imperatives becoming very salient. So at the same time as it embedding in this system ecologically in terms of creation, you're also forced to come to terms with the moral implications. It's a completely different thing from buying a pink lump of steak in a supermarket wrapped up in plastic. You're actually right there dealing with how the system functions.
Well, that's a great, it's a really fascinating topic, and I want to return to that a little bit more, actually after the break. But before we get to the break, would you just tell our audience, right, a little bit about you? How did you get interested in environmental science and stewardship? How did you get interested in your Catholic faith? Were these ever opposed to each other in your story? Right? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I was raised mainly in the Highlands of Scotland. My parents were fairly hippie-ish, so there was always gardening and foraging and all that sort of hunting and fishing going on. When I was 17, I left the island. I was from an island in the northwest of Scotland, moved to London, did my first degree there in environmental science. And then I spent a few years after that doing the kind of wandering around the world barefoot thing, which, like the environmental movement, had some really good things, I think, and very formative things, and also lots of not so very good things. But then I was 23, I ended up on a kind of open-ended surf trip to the west of Ireland. And on the first day there, I arrived at a house to meet some friends of a friend, and a girl waved out of the top of the window, and that was Anna, who I've been married to now for 25 years this summer. She was from a fishing family. Her dad and two of her brothers were commercial fishermen, so I went fishing with them for a while. And that sort of beat me into shape in a way. Fishing's extremely demanding and requires quite a lot of commitment. And then out of that, while I was fishing, I became aware of the environmental issues associated with commercial fishing, and I went on to do a master's degree and then a PhD in fisheries science. And subsequently, the last 25 years now, I suppose I've been involved in all sorts of research projects around the world on hunting and fishing systems and sustainability and so on, and then gradually trying to shift that research towards the Christian implications and components of that. So here we are in Florida now. Wow,
that's quite a story. So that's, in a way, you settled down both into kind of your professional and academic engagement. How did that interact with your with your understanding of the Catholic faith? Or
yes.
Because obviously the environmental movements, environmental science are often there's a tendency among those to kind of blame Christians for having this, yeah. That they were, seeing them, that we were, supposed to have dominion over creation. There's at least this argument, and I think that's really that's a misunderstanding of the stewardship that's called for.
That's right.
The Lord is also meant to have dominion, but the Lord is a merciful, kind Lord, gracious. That's how He reveals Himself to be. So clearly, Adam and Eve, in their roles as in the image and likeness of God, were also meant to be, right, have His face, which is merciful, kind, steadfast, right? So the fact that we are not is just our own sins.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Yeah.
But that being said, so how does one go, though, amidst this kind of almost, wandering the world barefoot, looking for surf vacations, to, meeting a woman and developing a profession of fishery and then environmental work? And then somehow being, really, I think this beautiful area of this integration between our Catholic faith and environmental stewardship, but one that's not well trodden.
No, and I guess this is why I can speak about the environmental movement sort of from the inside. So I was, during the wandering period, more or less in common with many people in the environmental movement, caught up in sort of esoteric distractions. But then while I was fishing in Ireland that time, and meeting Anna and getting involved with that whole thing, I went to Mass for the first time. And I was kind of compelled by this. I had no idea what was going on. People were standing up and sitting down and saying all these things, and I didn't know what was going on. Or I was brought up as a Presbyterian, actually, in Scotland. But I really felt unexpectedly that I encountered Jesus for the first time in the Catholic Church. And so when the weather was bad and I couldn't go fishing, I started going to the local priest for instruction in the faith. And Anna was away, actually. My now wife was away at this time. She was off for a year, which was quite good because she left me behind to kind of follow my own Catholic journey. So then I became a Catholic, more or less just accepting that it was the right thing to do, and then the framework followed from it afterwards. But I was really delighted to find that here was an intellectually robust and coherent framework for thinking about reality, and in this case particularly for thinking about creation and our role with regard to creation, which I'd never found fulfilled by the more hippie-ish constructs, basically. Yeah, so it took a long time for that to unfold and for that to integrate with the science. But yeah, it really makes sense.
That's really beautiful, and what a gift to be able to study that. And in some ways, you falling in love first with the natural world, and seeing all its beauty, and then recognizing in a way that it's even more beautiful because it's not just there; it was actually created. Yeah. It was willed and loved into being, and is an expression of God's. It's God's handiwork, right? It's kind of this beautiful, and that doesn't rob the beauty and wonder of the natural world. It actually invests it with even greater beauty. Yeah,
it's so much more profound and dramatic than any of the sort of pantheistic things that I might have come across before. Yeah, because you're drawn up into something absolutely wonderful. Into a plan of God.
And one of the downsides too is I've heard expressed this idea that human beings are the virus on the planet.
Yeah.
So the more you love the plant, the more you love nature, the more you despise yourself. Mm-hmm. And this is just a questionable thing. And I also wonder, to what extent can we despise human beings and maintain a love of nature, right? I mean, ultimately, if it's kind of an illusion that because human beings are part of the natural world, right. And if we don't like them, why do we like predators, for instance? Predators also kill a lot of things.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just like prey. Right? Does this make, and then all of a sudden we're just now being again, we're manipulating and ordering. So I think this sense of learning to have a deep sense of the wonder of all of creation is really a gift. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back, and I want to talk a little bit more about maybe, a couple issues that you face when you teach or speak on these topics. And also, you've done some wonderful things with students here and in your Pursuit of Wisdom show as well about how do we recover a sense of being able to see creation and kind of recover a little bit of the wonder and, as you called it, like becoming embedded within our own, natural environment. So we're going to talk about that when we return from the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
I like one of the things you do in some of your teaching and speaking and this course you did for the Pursuit of Wisdom is trying not – okay, I think there's a tendency where we want to look at a situation and try to solve it, which is fine at times. Mm-hmm. But even with respect to this issue, I think at times we want to what's the right attitude to have? Either, okay, we don't want to fall prey to the extremes of the environmentalist movement that basically want to kind of almost deify nature and demonize human beings and forget God. Okay, that doesn't seem to work. But nor do we want to have kind of a modern view that sees the natural world as merely just raw material to be exploited. Mm-hmm. Nor do we want to just kind of like totally ignore the environment as though somehow, Jesus doesn't want us to actually like care about the soil, right? Okay, So some of those things. But one of the things that I think you also suggest in your work kind of implicitly is that part of what we need to do is actually go about an internal transformation. It's not about simply having the right ideas about God. It's learning to come to know God. Now, we will come to know God better if we have right ideas about God. If we have false beliefs about God, it's very hard to get to know God. So we do need to have right beliefs about creation and stewardship in the natural world. But that's meant so that we can enter into a relationship. We were alienated from the natural world due to sin.
Right.
There's somehow like a curse between us and the natural world due to our pride. Just like human beings, our relationships with one another, even marriage expresses this throughout history. And so we have to learn to recover, not only to see God, but to see creation. So tell us a little bit about how how can we come to learn to see creation better?
Yeah, I think this is a really lovely question. So we start again from the point that we think of creation as God's first book. So as you say, it's really an expression of how wonderful He is and how imaginative and creative and delightful. So I suggest that a lot of the time we just don't notice where we are. We go outside and we're just kind of walking along. It's like this green-red flux passing by us on either side. And we're so busy, and particularly with these evil mobile telephones. So we have to stop, and this comes back to part of the hunting and fishing thing as well. It enables you to stop and actually focus on where you are and what's going on around you. And that just takes time. There's no shortcut to this. So I tend to suggest to people, and this is one of the assignments in the environmental science class here at Ave Maria University, is just to go outside and find somewhere to sit, find somewhere to be. So sit down under a tree or sit down next to the water or climb up into a tree or hide under a bush or something and just sit still and just try and concentrate on where you are. And there's nothing kind of hippie about this. It's sort of, and you can engage this with a explicit prayer as well. But what you find is that after a little while, this kind of blur starts to resolve out into the wonder, this kind of hierarchical wonder of what God's made. So no, it's no longer just a green thing, it turns into a tree. And then it's no longer a tree, but it's a tree with leaves and branches and bark. And then within that, there's so many different species operating their own ecological functions. Like an oak tree in England, for example, can have up to 1,000 different species living in it. So it's a massive creation unto itself. So then you start to notice little bugs crawling around looking for food, or mice on the ground, or birds going past. And this kind of blur of noise also starts to resolve out into different bird calls and animals and so on. Yeah, and that's a legitimate way of learning about God. He made the world, and the more we understand ecological structure and function, I think the more we can understand the wonder of who God is.
It's kind of an unlikely turn that I'm going to make now, but I think it really echoes that. So recently I read through Thérèse of Lisieux's Story of a Soul.
Oh, yeah.
And Thérèse, perhaps probably one of the most famous saints or the most popular saints in the 20th century, lived at the end of the 1800s and died at 24 from tuberculosis, entered the Carmelites at 15, was told by her superiors to write down, her own journal.
Yeah.
And in that journal, it's very interesting. And Thérèse is known as the one who, the little way and the little flower and the holy face of Jesus, and that discovers God's elevator, that I can't climb the stairs to holiness, but God wants me to be holy, so He's going to pick me up in His arms, and His arms will be the elevator.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And all of this. But in the Story of a Soul, it was interesting, about 5 different times, as she's narrating her childhood, she describes, on the pilgrimage that they took to Rome, the way she would look out at the fields and see all the flowers.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
There's one time when she's with her sister Celeste, and they look up and they see the stars. There's a story that I think she loves snow, and it snowed on.
That's right, yeah.
I think it was the day of her vows.
Yeah, I think it was her profession.
Her profession. And all of a sudden you notice, and I was reading this for a class about kind of, love, friendship, and the future of being human, and where we're looking at some of the ways in which we've lost the capacity to be human and therefore lost the capacity for love and friendship. And so we're going to read that book at the end of the semester.
Oh, fantastic.
But a lot of the stuff we've been doing is looking at this technology, and I'm noticing one of those things, what happens when people stop noticing the created world? And the beauty of the created world is actually they lose the ability to notice their own created beauty and, of course, the beauty of the creator, right? And it was really amazing. And so I think I'd just like you to talk – it's a great example of sitting down, but, I mean, I feel like this is such a lost art of trying to actually look and see. Lewis and Tolkien were, I think, great lovers of the natural created world. Lewis would love to go for walks all over the place in both, I think, Northern Ireland as well as in England. Both in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, one of the it's when they just start cutting down trees for fun, just for pure exploitation. This is kind of an awful thing. The trees end up, of course, fighting back in the Lord of the Rings. It's also in Chronicles of Narnia. The trees fight back. But I think they had a sense of kind of the dignity, or not dignity is quite weird, but at least the wonder in the sense that there's a real kind of splendor in the created world. And if we can't learn to see that, we won't be able to see it in ourselves and we'll turn it away from God. And so what's happened somehow in modernity, we've gotten so obsessed with looking at the things that we make with our hands, we see all of the world and even ourselves as what we can make with our hands. So what would you just walk us through maybe another exercise so we can try to learn to see maybe not even just not only just the natural world, but maybe even ourselves as part of the natural world.
I think this is really important. We used the word earlier on, the word embedding or embedded. So I think about maybe how this dynamic should really work, and I think Tolkien and the C.S. Lewis would perhaps would agree with this as well. So imagine, this is completely romanticized, of course, so imagine a little village somewhere in the rural part of Italy. And you think about it, the architecture and the dialect and the culture and the festivals, the whole cycle of life, the food, of course, is emerged kind of naturally from the weather and from the geology, from the climate, from a long, long history of people being there. So that's a life in which the person is gardening the environment and the resources that's been given to them in an entirely organic way. And I think this is an appropriate human nature dynamic. This is this gardening we're talking about. Whereas a lot of places in the world now, we live in a way which is not embedded in that way at all. Our houses are completely sort of synthetic. They're artificially dropped onto the environment. And we have lots of power. We have air conditioning. We have food which comes from all over the world. And we're speaking one language and so on and so forth. So we're naturally, on our day-to-day life, incredibly insulated from reality. Whereas the starting point that we're talking about here is to become docile to reality, to accept that there is a created order, that we're part of it, and we actually benefit from recognizing our place. So I would just encourage people, and this is what I'm trying to do here with the farm and the ideas of environmental stewardship here in the university. We can talk more about that. But to try and penetrate through this kind of plastic sphere or this digital telephonic sphere that we live in which we're just abstracted from reality, and penetrate around, grow some vegetables, or, I don't know, build a hut out of logs in your garden, or get some hens or something which compels you to be where you are and to ground yourself in the actual system where you are.
Yeah, it's mystery. My wife got a horse about 6 years ago, and partly with the idea of kind of like equine therapy.
Right.
And
lovely.
There's just a wonderful presence to be around a horse. Yep. It's a large animal. You got to pay attention.
Yeah, it's frightening.
You got to pay attention to what's in front of you. And it's also, you can do dumb things and you can fall off horses, as I've done, and it's real. And you're kind of learning to re-encounter things. And I think having that same attitude, not only with respect to, say, gardens or vegetables or hens, but then I've recognized maybe we could have that same attitude towards other people. Yeah. Just letting other people being in other people's presence. I heard that some of those villages in Italy that have very long lifespans, they've looked at that and they've said, we should eat what they eat. But it turns out it's not just because they eat fish and use olive oil, because those were just what was local to them. And there was some study that said when they first moved to, I think, Pittsburgh or something, and they started using lard, they still lived just as long. Because it was the whole social interaction of grandparents and great-grandparents sitting around and talking while the children and grandchildren were working. And that's what kept them alive. It was this integral ecology. So every time, I think at least it's very important, and Benedict XVI speaks about this. It was taken up somewhat in parts of Laudato Si by Francis, is that when we always want to recover a sense of the environment with respect to human ecology, because you can't sustain human ecology without being attentive to these same realities. So I really think that's beautiful. So I'd love to just dive in a little bit more now. You are starting a new minor in agriculture and Catholic environmental stewardship at Ave Maria. You quote Benedict XVI, right? The environment is God's gift to everyone, and in our use of it, we have a responsibility toward the poor, toward future generations, and toward humanity as a whole. So tell us a little bit about what you are hoping to do, and right, getting back into kind of agriculture seems kind of, in some ways, this seems like modern universities are trying to leave this behind. So why do you think it's something that we ought to recover?
Yeah, this is something I've been trying to do for a really long time. Again, I talk about this divergence between the science and the faith aspects of my life and the desire to bring them together. Ave Maria University already has this aspiration as with its liberal arts core, doesn't it? So all the students have to learn a little bit of theology and some philosophy and mathematics and science and try and form themselves as holistically as possible as a human person. And so this seems to provide this really great opportunity to add into that a more explicit but really, again, holistic focus on care for creation. So we've set up this minor, and in the minor the students will do some science, the kind of obvious things, environmental science and ecology. They're going to do some theology, and they're going to do a little bit of business, learning about how to operate a small business if they want to set up some kind of farming enterprise. And so the idea is that this will kind of address the sense that a lot of students have that they really should be dealing with the environmental problem, but they're not quite sure how to do it. So I would anticipate anyone, from someone who wants to stay at home but just have a few veggies and a few chickens on the side, through to someone who wants to become, I don't know, an international scientist or environmental lawyer, anyone like will benefit from this rather broad understanding or broad Catholicization of the environmental issue.
Yeah. And why is it important that you're not merely studying these things in the classroom, but that for this particular phenomenon, you have to also experience it in the actual. So you're not only starting a minor, you're starting an actual farm.
Yeah.
Right. So a whole.
Yeah.
And what's that going to include? Well,
that's incredibly important. This is sort of what we've been talking about. Is that if you're going to care for the creation, if you're going to care for what's made, you have to be integrated into it. You have to encounter it. You have to deal with it. You have to be touching the soil. You have to be growing. You have to be learning. And that kind of practice is a real school of virtue. You're striving for excellence in challenging practical tasks which compel you to learn how to do the right thing in the right way at the right time. And that's also fundamental to being a good steward.
Yeah. So, maybe what different things, maybe what are you going to start with, and where do you want to be in 5 years? Because we are in Southwest Florida. So on the one hand, it's kind of strange. We don't really have a lot of historical farming down here that's been it's been farmed for 50 or more years, but a lot of very rather mechanized farming, tomato areas that are just, as far as the eye can see, just more tomatoes, more tomatoes. But we also have, of course, wonderful birds and the marine life and these the kind of estuaries, and also we're in the Everglades somewhat. Of course, it's no longer the Everglades, but we were. Right. So how do you see what sorts of animals maybe do you want to begin with? What sorts of fish do you want to try to include? What sorts of are we going to do orange trees? Are we going to do tomatoes? All these different things.
Yeah, it was so exciting. So it looks like we're going to have 55 acres for a farm, really quite a significant farm. And this is going to be set up as a charity, kind of parallel to University Minor. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with just using about an acre to develop a very beautiful tropical food forest. So we're going to have fruit bushes and trees and plants, and we're going to build a couple of pavilions and things like that to be in. But then I hope it's kind of going to be a bit providential, I think, how it unfolds. It's remarkable how it's happened already. But yeah, I would like to have hens, at least initially, so that's an easy thing to do, but it would be fantastic if we could have, you talked about therapy horses, we can have sheep for wool, we can do some kind of ground-up building projects. I'd like to have classrooms out there and places for resident students and visitors. I think what we can do, what I really hope we can do is create what can be a worldwide demonstration of how Catholic environmental stewardship really functions. So as you say, you learn the minor, you learn the theory, and on the farm you see how to actually practice it.
That's great. What would you say for people that maybe, are hearing this and, maybe, I don't know, maybe they're in a city, maybe they're in a suburb. A lot of what you're saying may be attractive, but it's going to be hard for them to experience. What would you say that people could do, in their day-to-day lives that might help to kind of recover a little bit of this sense of wonder?
Yeah, we were talking a bit about that in class this morning, actually. So we were thinking about the problem of plastics being distributed about the world, as microplastics being found in the Arctic and on the top of Mount Everest. And we were wondering, how could we as individual virtuous stewards do something about that? But I think wherever you are, you can always do something. If it's a question of using less of the resources of creation, right, wasting less, or with regard to encounter with nature, there's always something you can do, even if it's from a window box of herbs, which you then cook with, right? That's a kind of grounding and embedding. Or you participate in programs at your local park, or you head out to the country sometimes, or maybe never. Yeah, just try and engage with where you are. I think your own place is perhaps the starting point.
Yeah, and it also occurs to me that I think we have a tendency as moderns to want to kind of control the environment one way or another. Yeah. And so if we're trying to dominate it, we do that. Or if we're trying to save it, we try to do that.
To do something.
And the point of I think we need to recover. We can't do it. Like, we can't save the environment. It's above our pay scale to save a planet. Yeah. It's above our pay scale to impact what 8 billion people are doing. Right? This is just but I think if we return to the monastic understanding that when the monks were, ora et labora, when they were praying and working and they were gardening and they were raising chickens and making beer and all these sorts of different things and cheese, they were doing it because if they learned to kind of tame a little bit of their own libido dominandi, their own lust for domination, their own lust for control, their own pride, then they were doing something beautiful for God. Yeah. And it's kind of that sort of thing. I think turning away our attention, is this going to impact Mount Everest or the polar bears? Yeah. Set that aside. Just above our pay grade.
Yeah. It's too abstract.
It's too abstract. But, but if I do something where I just learn, if I change myself, in a certain sense, that has like eternal implications. Yeah. And I think that's what the monks recognized. They changed, ironically, ended up somewhat preserving Western civilization and having an impact, but only because they weren't trying to have one. Yeah. And I think that's an element that, if we begin to really to change ourselves and just to practice little disciplines, and I think, both that curtail some of our, desires for luxuries or for just being comfortable. Another thing I also think is helpful is, I think for better or for worse, we live with a lot of mobility. Yep. I love the fact you say starting in your place, but I also think, when I think about as I'm doing this podcast, it's like my mind goes back to it was a couple of years ago. I went on a hike with a son, and we ended up hiking this trail and ended up finding this like 50-foot waterfall. It was incredible. Yeah. A time when I was, anyway, like a handful of different hikes that I've gone on the Smoky Mountain National Forest in North Carolina. A time I went out to the Rocky Mountain National Forest out in National Park out in Colorado. Yep. And so I also think sometimes maybe just saying, hey, what if it would, I think there's something beautiful to perhaps, having and setting up some of these times where we do kind of have these little retreats. Yep. We should also go on spiritual retreats with Jesus. That's a good thing. But also going on kind of like, vacations where we learn to kind of maybe go hunting or fishing. And we're not going to live up on the lakes. Right? No, but we can go visit them for a couple weeks or a weekend here and do those sorts of things. So maybe I think that's another thing that people can do to kind of recapture a little bit of that sort of sense of wonder.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I would love to live in a small hut by myself in Alaska, but of course most of us can't do that. I'm envious of the people who can. But yeah, we all have responsibilities. But this is the good thing about these wonderful national parks and these large areas of somewhat wilderness, that we can use them for retreat. Yeah, they're wonderful. Beautiful. Let's go out there and spend some time, yeah.
Excellent. So any final words you'd want to say to people who might be interested in maybe learning more about some of your work, or this kind of integration of the Catholic faith with environmental stewardship?
Yeah, so I kind of approach this from two directions. So what I'm trying to do is make sure that what I say about stewardship is scientifically rigorous. So my articles are available in various different scientific journals, but also I want to try and inform the scientific process with this reality that the Church has such a beautiful framework, the optimal framework, I think, for understanding how to deal with care for the earth. So then there's another sort of parallel set of writing that I'm trying to do there, which deals with that perspective. Yeah.
Excellent. So we're coming up on the end of our time. I want to ask you 3 questions that I ask all my guests. So I'd love to tell me about a book you're reading.
Yeah, so I'm reading 2 books at the moment. One is After Virtue, Alistair McIntyre, which is the sort of ongoing battle, basically.
Wow, a wonderful book.
It's absolutely amazing. It's so helpful.
I read that in my undergraduate and probably changed my life and ended up putting me on the trajectory, of course, because of the teacher in some ways who was teaching it.
Right.
But,
I need to teach.
But it came out. But I remember reading it as my senior year, and really kind of set me on a path of kind of deep engagement with philosophy and theology.
Well, that's right. Yeah. It's extraordinary. Well, I have to confess I've been reading it now for about 3 months, because I read a chapter and then I think, I understood about 5% of that, so I'm going to read it again.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. But the other book I'm reading, I just started to read it, and I'm not going to give the title because I find it a bit disappointing, but it's about the God and the natural world, God and creation. But the conclusion of the author is that the best way to be a good steward is to leave organized religion and just become a sort of, outdoor prayer warrior type person. I was thinking, no, that's not the right thing to do, because, we operate together as a community of faith.
And it's kind of romantic, right, in some ways. It's like a romantic kind of, it's this illusion. How would you even, it's fun once you've received faith to then wander away from the church, sort of, okay? But you would have never learned the faith. You would have never learned that you were created by God unless the institutional church had been around to pass that message to you.
Well,
so
absolutely.
It's like we completely forget about this.
No, but the thought of heading out into nature without the sacrament of confession is rather frightening to me as well.
Nature's a harsh place, right? And second question: what's a practice you do on a regular basis to draw closer to God? Right.
Well, at Ave Maria University, we have this program called Mary's Marines, which is about a daily commitment to Eucharist adoration. So before work every day, I spend half an hour before Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament. And that's wonderful. Just shapes my entire day, basically. There he is. Sometimes I just go and give out to him, Lord, this is a disaster, what's going on? Other times I'm able to kind of encounter him more. But the adoration's really formative.
And what's a belief you held about God that you later learned was false?
I went into a church the other day really in a bad mood, and there was Jesus crucified. And I was thinking, there's nothing else you could be doing which would be satisfactory to me now. If you're doing anything else, I'd be thinking, you don't understand, you don't love me, you don't know what it's like. But there he is on the cross. And I think I had never really grasped that the Lord is absolutely with us, even in the mayhem and brokenness of human life. He really has this capacity to penetrate to the heart of what it is to be a suffering human. And that was a revelation to me. Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shephard, Sam, for being on our show. We're so glad to have you here at the university, but also with our audience. And it's really powerful, so I really appreciate that. I do also want to just say that if people that are kind of interested in thinking about this from a different perspective, I did a podcast episode with Joseph Pierce on the Silmarillion and Tolkien, and it's really about kind of Tolkien's attempt at trying to recover a sense of creation imaginatively through literature that helps us to appreciate it when we've tended to kind of reduce it all to what we can make. And so that might be an episode that people would find
Great.
interesting. But
Yeah.
thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
And for people who are interested more, can they? How would they find you or find some of your work?
It's best at the moment to email me probably, or on my university profile. I have some
Okay, so at
recommendations.
avemaria.edu,
That's correct.
They can find Samuel Shephard.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and thanks to our audience for being with us today on the Catholic Theology Show. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider subscribing and sharing the news about the podcast with some of your family and friends. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.